Hello, my name is Adnai,
My name is Leslie.
and we'll be your host for today's ARCC Deep Dive show on language and identity.
Today, we're actually diving into a really interesting topic about how language plays a role in the Black experience. We'll be unpacking how language shapes its identity in the Black community and how it fuels anti-racist activism.
Today, joining us are two amazing linguistic professors who know all about linguistics. Today, we'll be talking with them about how language is relevant to the Black community and anti-racist activism. So, today we have first Dr. Jessie Greaser, who is an associate professor of linguistics at the University of Michigan. She works on Black language with the goal of better understanding the role that Black language plays in Black identity. We also have Dr. Erica Britt joining us today, who is an associate professor of linguistics at Emory University. She's a sociolinguist and a discourse analyst, and her work also focuses on the use of African American language in public and political life. So let's welcome Dr. Jessie Greaser and Dr. Erica Britt to the show today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys, for joining us. It's really great to have you both here. So every time we have a guest speaker on our show, we like having them introduce themselves and share a little bit about your work. So whoever wants to go first, you can go ahead and talk about that.
Who's going to break the ice? I guess I can jump in and go first. So I'm Erica Britt. I'm an associate teaching professor at Emory in the linguistics program. And as you mentioned, I study African American language in public and political life. That's my primary area of research. And I'm pretty fascinated by this idea of Black public speakers who, in spaces that are typically coded as white, professional kind of spaces, bringing with them Black linguistic practices and bringing those language practices in ways that show a pride for Black culture and their unwillingness to just kind of tear these parts of identity from themselves as they climb the social economic ladder. And another dimension of my work is looking at oral history. So I've been living and working in Flint for 12 years, and we spent time in that predominantly Black city collecting oral histories about language and life, and how do media representations of cities shape people's impressions, especially impressions of people in predominantly Black cities, and how people challenge those public images.
And I'm Jessie Greaser, and I'm an associate professor of linguistics at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And I work on very similar questions. I think a lot of the times when you're working on a minoritized language variety, or a language variety spoken by minoritized speakers, you're thinking a lot about what is the role of this in allowing people to indicate an identity that's marginalized in ways that are presented in ways of pride and connect people back to their communities. And so for me, what that often looks like is looking at what role do Black language practices play in authenticating Black identity when Black identity is not what's on the table. And so that is often in work about like place. And so how do you show that you are a Black person in a particular place, and what ways does that work? Sometimes it's online. So what is the role of Black language in creating sort of opposition online or memes or things that indicate particular kinds of attitudes? So kind of how do people do race through language in ways that make the race part a little bit more covert?
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing.
Yes, thank you so much. Now that we know a little bit more about you guys, I personally, like I said earlier, did not know what linguistics was until a few months ago. And a lot of our audience members may or may not know what linguistics is. So could you guys just briefly give a small definition of what linguistics is, whoever wants to go?
I think we each should probably give our
Yeah.
standard definition. It'll be really interesting to hear them both. Um, I,
You
I,
want to go first?
I suppose I volunteered myself to go first. When I have to explain linguistics to people, I explain to people that linguists approach language the way a biologist approaches the body versus a doctor. right? Where the biologist is really interested in how do all of these pieces work? How do they fit together? How do they influence each other? And a doctor is really interested in, okay, how do we fix it and make it work the way that we think it's supposed to work? But the biologist is just interested in, well, it doesn't work that way. So like maybe we should figure something else out. And that's very much how linguists approach language. But a lot of people think we're doctors, which makes life complicated.
That's right. I think that's a really great way of framing it because, like, the textbook definition of linguistics is a scientific study of language. And I guess the question is, well, what does all of that mean? That kind of systematic approach to finding out how language works. And I think the thing that drew me to linguistics is that we're really interested in not how you should speak, but how do you speak? And what does that tell us about the nature of the brain, the nature of your language faculty, and what's possible in human language. And I think it's a central kind of way of understanding humanity, because I think language mediates just about every dimension of human life. So to know how your brain processes and acquires language, and then how you use it in everyday situations can tell us, again, a lot about the human being and the human existence.
Yeah. That makes sense. Thank you guys so much for explaining that so clearly and like not the textbook definition, because I feel like you could always read a textbook but never really understand what the actual details of what linguistics is. So I also want to ask you guys a follow-up question to that, because I know you guys study specifically African American linguistics. So now that you specialize in Black language, could you talk about what Black language is? And I would also like to ask the question, some people claim that Black language is not a real language. Some say it's an accent or a dialect. So what would you say to people who believe that Black language is not a real language? Or what would you say to that claim, and what exactly is Black language?
A lot there. So I guess I can jump in with the idea of Black language in general. When I teach my students about Black language, and there's so many terms that you will encounter: African American language, African American English, Black language, like there's so many different ways of referring to the speech of, I typically focus on African Americans in the United States, but it's a set of linguistic practices. And I think many linguists, have different kind of focus, like the kind of narrow focus that they take. But I tend to look at the speech of the descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States and how that speech has evolved over time. And again, it includes, the words, the syntax, the pronunciations, but also the kind of ways of getting those words out, the discourse practices, the styles, all the ways of communicating that are distinctive to the descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States. Sure, there's more to be said about that. So let Dr. Grieser add.
Yeah, I mean that covers a lot of what I'm thinking. And I'll say that one thing I really love about the term Black language, and I think we may get to this question later on, but is this idea of Black as being a cultural practice. And so there's lots of ways of being a part of the global Black community that are not necessarily African American. It's not necessarily about the descendants of slaves. And so you'll often hear those of us who tend to work with that population specifically naming, no, like, and I also work mostly with the descendants of slaves in the United States, and that is a particular kind of Black community. But Black language practices exist in all sorts of spheres, right? There are Black diasporic Spanish practices there, and they are remarkably similar to the practices that are used by Black American English speakers in how they function and how they differ from sort of standardized mainstream acceptable kinds of things. And notice I'm putting those in huge scare quotes for those of y'all who are just listening. And so that opposition and that authentication of identity through language is, to me, what's central in thinking about Black language, and also the systematicity. So people think that Black language is not systematic, and it absolutely is, whether we're talking about the level of how words are formed, or whether we're talking about big, broader rhetorical practices that you might bring into a preaching situation. It is patterned.
That's right. And kind of tying into that, thinking about the resistance to calling Black speech language, right? And I kind of whenever I encounter that pushback and that idea of the systematicity of Black language, we are kind of, as linguists today, counteracting centuries of racist discourse about Black American speech. And I'm again focusing on a specific subset of Black language. But early white writers, when they encountered the language of enslaved Africans, would say things like, "Well, this is the language that sounds like child speech," or maybe not even human speech altogether, right? And so there was such a strong resistance to even saying that we had language, like saying we don't have culture, we don't have religion, we don't have humanity. And so I think the idea of saying it is language is to reassert the humanity of African Americans and the Black diaspora and the linguistic practices of the Black diaspora, and really claiming, that right for our linguistic practices to be seen, to be respected, to elevate them to a status that maybe sometimes using the term dialect doesn't do. And, I think on a structural kind of argument, maybe linguists might say that African American speech falls on a continuum, on a dialect continuum, but there's a very political place to say that this is Black language, to kind of assert the autonomy, to assert the right of this community to see itself as a community, to see itself as having linguistic practices that should be supported and validated. So when I encounter that resistance to calling it Black language, I ask the person to think about, well, what's the source of the resistance, first of all? What are we conjuring up from history, centuries of discourse about Black language that this brings up for you when you say, I don't want to call it a language? Okay, well, what's that about?
I love that you just said that because it's one of the questions that I was kind of about to ask, and like the relationship between language and identity, and like understanding how that can affect yourself. Because I definitely struggled a lot with that growing up, at least with it being a Spanish speaker and trying to identify myself as Latina, but also like I'm American, so I obviously have an American accent and all these things, and like how that impacts like whether you're Spanish enough or American enough, like all of that stuff really is important. So I will continue to ask the question. So like could you talk a little bit about the relationship of how like the language and identity work together and how it relates to each other a little bit more if you want. And then Dr. Grazer too, if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think identity is so central. I think in the United States, at least in my experience growing up, I was always taught that the way that Black people speak is not something to be celebrated. And it's something that's been internalized even in my own community. So, I wrestle even with my mom and some of my elders who are highly educated and who learned lessons from their own community of what good language was supposed to be. And we were always taught that Black language is not something that should be recognized. But Black language is where I am, right? When I find myself code switching into Black speech, Black discourse styles, vocabulary, pronunciations, I'm reconnecting with community, right? I'm reconnecting with family. And it's the same family who, when we moved to the suburbs, started saying I talk white, because when I moved to those suburbs, I learned that I had to give up my language. I had to give up all the ways that marked me as uniquely who I was. So for me, language is so much identity, right? I'm reconnecting to those spaces that I was told I wasn't supposed to connect with, or I wasn't supposed to be proud of. And it is for me, it's clearly very much an identity marker that I'm proud of, and that I'm encouraging more and more young people to be proud of. So I think identity is central for me, Black language and identity go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we do ourselves through all sorts of ways. Like you think about the ways that you dress, you think about the car you drive, all of those sorts of things signal things to other people. And one of the fastest, easiest, and most fundamental ways we have of signaling who we are is through our language and what we sound like. Really simple, basic thing is that small children who want to be perceived as femme start speaking in higher voices, even though they're just little kids. They've all got the same like length of vocal tract. It's not their physiology that's doing it. It is this expectation that, oh, I'm an 8-year-old who wants to be perceived of as a girl. I'm going to start sounding more girly by making my voice a little bit higher. And we have all sorts of data on that. And so Black language practices are no different than any other kind of language practice. It's about that connection. It's about that ability to show who you are. I actually have the opposite situation where my history with linguistics and language was that I'm transracially adopted. And at some point in time, I'm going to start my big transracial adoption project that I have been wanting to do for 20 years. And so I was raised by white Ohioans. My parents like can trace themselves 6 generations back to like the small towns in Germany that they came from. And my oldest brother is their biological son. He's white. And I grew up with their variety. And I was very much praised for that because, oh, I sounded exactly the way my teachers wanted me to sound. And also I was brown. So like that was magic. Like I just somehow like magically like got it perfect and all the other brown kids sounded wrong, right? And like even at that age, you know, this is 5 or 6 years old starting school, I'm kind of going, something seems off here. And but then I got really into my friend groups and starting to know people and realizing, oh, I don't sound like all the people who look like me. And if I don't, there's something missing. There's a connection I'm not going to be able to make. And it was that realization and then having to really pick up a language variety that nobody had at home that allowed me to sort of see the matrix and go, okay, like here's how this language is functioning. I can see exactly how it's functioning for me. I can start to think about how it functions in broader ways.
Yeah, you also answered partially another one of my questions. You guys are on a roll. Because I was gonna ask like that same question of, have you ever been told you don't sound Black enough? And you have probably been told that, it looks like. But what does that mean to you as a linguist specifically? And like, why do you think people say it so often? And, you know, it's like the first in their mind, like they see you and they're like, oh, she doesn't sound Black enough, or she doesn't sound like she's Black. Like, what's the first thing that pops into your mind?
I mean, there's so much to that, right? For me, that started actually really young. So I grew up as a young kid in predominantly Black neighborhoods in South Florida, Liberty City area. And then our parents moved us to the suburbs. And when we went to the suburbs, we were the only Black family on the block. And that's where I picked up this very standard way of speaking. So when I would go home to my cousins and my grandma, they would say, "You sound white." And it was always such a shock for me, right? Because it was like, wait, I'm just talking like the kids at school. I didn't realize that it was marked in that way. I didn't realize it carried so much identity, right? And it was a shock to the system. So when I encountered that, even as adult, because I think my academic trajectory has meant that most of the spaces I've been in are standardized English speaking, right, where Black language is not the language in those spaces. So I speak that actually quite fluently. It is my predominant dialect now. And so there's always this kind of weird feeling of, well, who am I? Where do I belong? If someone hears my voice, says I'm not Black, I know I'm Black, I know I've lived a life as a Black woman in this country, but yet they've erased that possibility simply because my language doesn't carry the markers that someone thinks is authentically Black enough, right? And so I know it kind of causes a crisis. It stops me in my tracks. It kind of makes me wonder, well, who am I and where do I belong in the world? And then I realized that actually I do carry a lot of those linguistic practices. It's just that they're muted. They're not on the front stage in places where I know I'm going to be targeted, or I know that people are going to say, well, you speak this way, so you're not intelligent, or you're not an authority, or XYZ that comes up.
Yeah. I think for me, because I was coming at it from the other direction, where I had to learn to sound Blacker and to have some of the features that allowed me to connect to my community, but also preserved. People we expect women to sound more standardized, more correct, more proper, whatever terrible positive word you want to put on it. I teach a whole class about those terrible positive words and all the things that they entail. But we expect women to sound a certain way, and so then when we also add that to, well, okay, we also have women who might be speaking a language variety that is marginalized even further. There's all of these expectations. And I think that's what led me to be really interested in some of the subtle's probably the wrong word, but there's some very marked is the linguistic term for it. And that means something that very much stands out. So for example, there is a man with long hair that is a marked hairstyle for men, even though in this day and age is quite common. But we still consider it unusual. It stands out. It means something. You're doing something if you identify as a man and you have long hair, right? And so we have some features of Black language that are more like that. And they're the kinds of ones that you hear people making fun of. Ain't, or didn't nobody do nothing, or all of those sorts of double negatives, those sorts of things. And those are often not what you hear from, for instance, professional Black women. But it doesn't mean you don't hear them being Black, and you don't hear us being Black. And I think that's what led me to focus on some of those smaller things of, okay, like how does someone do something that nobody notices except the Black people that they really want to make sure hear it?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks so much for sharing that.
Sorry, my mic wasn't working for a second, but I definitely agree with what you guys are saying as well. Like I definitely experienced you don't sound Black enough being raised in like a primarily white area and having like other African Americans say that I don't sound Black enough or etc. So I definitely resonate with what you guys are saying. And for the next question, I feel like you guys kind of answered this, so you guys are also on a roll. You guys are answering these questions good, but I would like to ask, how does language play a role in the Black experience? So if you want to answer that question too as well, but I guess the second part of the question is a little bit more important, but how can it create and sustain a community? So how does language have a possibility to create and sustain a community? You could also answer the question of how it also plays a role in the overall Black experience as well too.
And it's a tough question because we're dealing with Black experiences,
Mm-hmm.
right? And trying to think about the Black community gets difficult because, like, which dimension of the Black community and what, So I started, as soon as you asked the question, I started thinking generationally, right? And thinking about class and thinking about, so my mom is actually from Ohio, right? And from a middle class family in Ohio. And she has a very standardized way of speaking that was a hallmark of middle class Black people in that community. My father's from a very working class community in Miami who speaks the most vernacular kind of African American language. And they were both Black communities, but they were communities that were maybe separated by class, separated by region. But I think each of those communities had their norms, right? They had like, okay, how do I know who's an insider? How do I know who's an outsider? What's the language? Do you know the vocabulary? Do you know how to move? Do you know how to speak in a way that I can recognize that you're from here, right? You're from this community, and you're also racially marked, right? Like that you are doing something. I think Dr. Grieser really made a great point about sometimes those subtle things that we do with language, whether it's the pronunciations or the pitch or even the rhythm of our speech that lets someone know, yeah, that's a sister from my community. I recognize that that's Black language. But again, it may be different depending on where you are in the country and again, where you are in the world. Nevertheless, I still think that there is a kind of activist movement happening, and I'm seeing it actually in younger people. So I'm a Gen X, a millennial kind of cusp baby, and so I grew up in an era where people didn't necessarily openly celebrate Black language, but I'm seeing younger people who are actively getting on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and saying, Black people, we are going to use AAVE. We're going to use the most vernacular way of speaking, and no matter what space we go into, we are going to be proud of it. And in that space, I'm seeing community, right? I'm seeing a kind of use of, again, certain marked parts of AAE as a symbol of Blackness, perhaps resistance to white supremacy, kind of creating a collective identity. And again, that's one dimension of Black language, and that's one kind of space where I see community developing. But Black language can be symbolic, right? When people are using it to resist these patterns that we've learned for generations that say that it's not real, you can't speak it, you shouldn't speak it, you can't be intelligent when you speak it. that even kind of challenges some norms in middle class Black communities as well. So it gets complicated because, again, which Black community are we talking about, and what markers are they using to signal identity? I think is an important question to start with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I'll jump off that in almost a completely different direction. We also can talk about what we mean by language and what we mean by community. So like a lot of my work has merged my love of economics and urban development with my love of linguistics. And so I do a lot of studies of gentrifying communities and the ways. And so like when I'm talking about community, I'm very often talking about like literally a physical, we can draw a boundary, and also where the boundary is drawn is also often part of a signal of whether or not you're part of that community, and so on. And so sometimes using language to show that you're a part of a given community is sometimes about things like who's us and who's them, and who's a part of the group and who's not. And those are like that's not things that we would consider necessarily under the umbrella of like African American vernacular English. There's not a grammatical pattern that's happening there that is different than the way any other group would talk about it. But it becomes part of Black language when it becomes part of doing that Black community. Like when them turns out to be all white people, and us, as one of my interviewees, like he was saying, he goes, it's gonna become bad for us. And then he stopped and added us, meaning Black folk. And it's like, yeah, like that move. And that's a very subtle language move that it takes discourse analysis to pull out and go, what's going on here? That's part of creating community with Black language practice, right? Is who gets to be in it and who doesn't. The internet is doing very fascinating things, as Dr. Britt was talking about, both in authenticating the language and also in spreading it in really interesting ways. I gave a talk recently in which, oh, and I'm never going to be able to spell out the acronym on a podcast, but it was an acronym that went viral at the time that Georgia Governor Brian Kemp lifted restrictions in Georgia during COVID. And it's very profane, and it was like 16 letters long. And M stood for exactly what you thought it stood for. B stood for exactly what you think it stands for. S stood for exactly what you think it stands for. And it circulated as a litmus test of like, are you Black? And people were just sharing it out on Facebook going, oh yeah, I understood every word of this. Like I know exactly what it means. And it stood for, I don't give a blank what Brian Kemp says. You better stay ya blank blank in the blanken house. And people who were familiar with Black language and Black language internet practices could just clip right along with that. And so that's the kind of authentication that exists that allows you to do this kind of in-group, out-group thing with language practice.
And that one's so funny because I even could hear it in a Black mama's voice.
Right? Oh yeah, right.
I could hear the meme being said by a Black mama. You know, it was like, wow, how is this possible? What is it that we're pulling from that lets us know that? Actually, when you were talking about when he said Black, one of the discourse practices I think of is when Black people hold their hand up and they say, you know, it's not for us, or it's for, you know, it's not for us. And this idea of pointing to different sides of your hand to indicate you're talking about Black people or white people. And it's again, discourse, right? It's a code. It's a kind of way of communicating that we learn in community, but it's not about the grammar. It's not about the pronunciations. It's not those things, but it is a discourse practice. Where do we get that from? And how widespread is it, right? And what are those norms that we share as community that might know those ways to speak?
Yeah, and you guys have been talking a lot about discourse analysis, so I am going to ask the question about specifically what it is and how it relates to understanding identity, especially when it comes to race. Just because I've heard you guys talk about it a couple times, I feel like now you're, intriguing me into knowing more about what that is and how I can relate to this.
Well, I can jump in. It's
Let
you
you
know
start.
it's a methodology that we use. So typical linguistics research, the most theoretical linguistics, they focus on the phonetics and phonology, the syntax, and morphology, right? So the structural features of language and make claims about what those things are. Sociolinguists want to take those elements of language and put them into everyday social context. So if I'm making an utterance, and maybe it involves me code switching between African American language and standard English, discourse analysis oftentimes will ask, well, what's the function of that code switch piece, right? So why did that person switch? What was it about the local discourse, the local context in which they were speaking that conditioned it, that prompted that person to make that linguistic shift? What was the effect? How did people respond to that? And so I think discourse analysis is, again, looking at language in everyday life and looking at the mechanics of what's shifting or what's moving and how are people using language to construct identity. So a lot of my work was looking at Black politicians in a very public, formal conference, and how they would code switch, so the vocabulary would shift. One of the speakers was like, well, I am still a sister, right? And so she shifted to, this pronunciation where it's not sister, but sister, her vowel changed. She dropped the R in a very canonical way for Black language. But then that bigger context where it was a speech that she was giving because African Americans, she was a Black politician, Sheila Jackson Lee, and people were really ridiculing her because it was the 2008 elections and she had supported Hillary Clinton to be president. And people took that as an affront to Blackness. Like, you can't be authentically Black if you have supported Hillary Clinton. And in the context of this speech, she does this code switching. She affirms that she's a sister. And as a discourse analyst, I have to understand all of that, what's going on in the moment of her speech, what's happening in the broader social context, and then how all of that helps us as audience members read. I mean, I say read when we're participating and listening to someone speaking, we're kind of reading, we're kind of doing a kind of analysis of what they're trying to communicate and how it means. So for me, that's kind of like what discourse analysis on a broader level is, making sense of language in everyday life, and unpacking sometimes the not so transparent meanings in what people do as they shift language.
Mhm.
Dr. Grieser, if that's how you approach discourse analysis, or what do you add?
Yeah, I mean, I have almost nothing to add to that. It really, discourse analysis is, I sometimes describe it as stating the bleeding obvious that is not obvious. Like, we sort of all go, okay, for some reason, I felt more from her when she said she was a sister, but I can't really explain why or how. And actually, I want to give a shout out here to discourse analysis as a field has been highly driven by neurodivergent linguists. And I kind of love it because many of them predate an era in which we would have identified them as neurodivergent. But it's because of a desire to go, well, wait a minute, why did everybody else get that meaning? I didn't get that meaning. And that then fueled lots of people to go, okay, so wait a minute, how does this work exactly? Why is it when someone says it's warm in here, everybody else stood up and opened the window? I didn't hear a command to open a window. And so those are the sorts of connections that discourse analysis makes, is from that surface form to the thing that we sort of intrinsically understand was being said, and how are those two things connected?
Got it. Makes a lot of sense. Thank you for explaining that to our audience. And me as well, of course.
Of course. And just going on the topic of talking about what you guys are kind of researching within linguistics, because there's many subtopics within linguistics. I was just curious about the aspect of sociophonetics. So could one of you guys explain what sociophonetics is, or both of you guys as well, and how it could actually help us understand our identity? Just to know a little bit more about linguistics and the subtopics within it.
Sure, I'll run off with this one because this has been a big part of my research. So sociophonetics, as we've talked about sociolinguistics, which is this broader connection between language and social identity, social values, and sociocultural aspects of our lives. Sociophonetics is looking at, okay, what do individual small pieces of sound contribute to those kinds of identities? So, for example, you might think of things that you think of as being an accent, right? That if someone says ah instead of I, that we might associate blackness with that person. Black people do that. We might also associate southernness with that identity. Southern people do that. There's a lot of reasons. Well, actually, sorry, there's one reason. It's called slavery. Um, that slavery and Jim Crow that result in a lot of overlap between Southern English, Southern white Englishes, and African American English. So you'll find a lot of those sorts of practices. And so sociophonetics is looking at that level. And so linguists might be looking at individual vowel sounds. They might be looking at individual consonants. They might be looking at things like intonation or pitch. If you like to sound like this, why would you suddenly sound like this? And what kinds of things those identities might be doing. In my own work, most of my sociophonetic work has focused on a thing called final consonant devoicing. And so that's like if you said the word bed or the word lived, and you said bed or lived, and kind of had a sort of harder, a T sound there instead of a D sound. And one of the things that I uncovered is that this is something that middle-class Black people, especially middle-class Black women, are highly likely to do. My hypothesis about why that's happening is oftentimes Black language is maligned, as we've talked about. People want people to sound standardized. Your Black friends may not want you to sound white, but your teacher sure does, right? And so very often, if you come through schooling, somebody has said, oh, you better not say library. You better keep your endings. Don't you say west side. You gotta enunciate, right? And you'll hear that over and over and over again. And so as a result, this sort of over enunciating the ending becomes a part of what middle class educated Black speakers are starting to do. And then, really interestingly, it becomes a part of middle class Black speech. And so then it becomes a way of doing, I'm middle class and I'm educated and I'm Black. And it has this extra little piece. My favorite story about that is Michelle Obama does this left, right, and center. I tried to listen to Becoming on her audiobook because I just wanted to hear her read it, and I couldn't. I was just doing analysis the entire time. I had to pick up the paper book and read it because it's very much a part of the way that she learned to speak, because that's exactly the community she's a part of.
Yeah, I never even thought about that, but in my own language, my parents say that I speak Spanish like very well because I enunciate everything. I think it's because both of my parents have different ways of speaking Spanish. So I kind of just combine the way they talk, and then they say it sounds perfect. And I'm like, that's interesting. I never even realized that the sounds make a difference too, because I don't know if I sound like my family's Bolivian. I don't know if I sound Bolivian, but my mom says, "Oh, you speak the most perfect Spanish." And I'm like, I don't know. Like everyone else seems to be different from me. I'm the odd one out sometimes. So interesting to know like how sounds like make an impact on like your language and identity. So that was really interesting. I do want to ask a question about you guys specifically now. So obviously you both study linguistics and are also professors of color. And I wanted to understand like how your identities as Black women shaped your journey in academia, and then like what kind of challenges you faced along the way.
Goodness. It's a whole dissertation, I think. I don't know. It's interesting for me. My struggles started just with the entry into academia. When I was finishing my undergrad and thinking about going to grad school, and I'm, finished my undergrad, one of my master's degree in the South. And when I said that I wanted to go on to a PhD program, and when I listed the places where I wanted to go, It was interesting the pushback that I got. Are you sure you want to do that? I don't know. Those are really hard schools to get into. It might be kind of a challenge for you if, maybe you need to stay with us for another degree to be good enough to get in one of these programs. And it's odd because it might sound like reasonable, advice, but I think my alarm bells went off that this is because I'm Black. Like, you wouldn't say this to another student. And I'm saying this because I had the top grades. I was actually one of the top students in the program that I was in. I had just gotten an award from my department for academic excellence. So why were these same faculty turning around and telling me I'm shooting too high, I'm dreaming too hard for going into PhD programs? And it was insane because one of the programs that they told me I would never be able to get into, when I put my application in, I got a call back the week later from my then dissertation advisor to go to that program and be fully funded. But it was all those kind of moments where people had these doubts about me and my ability to succeed and to thrive that I always attribute to race, right? Because there was no other criteria. I was always an overperformer, always that student who was doing more than I needed to do to prove to people that I was good enough, but still the doubts would come in. And then, for me, going on the tenure track. So I was a tenure track professor and got tenure at the University of Michigan Flint. And even on that journey towards tenure, finding that I'm overproducing, like I'm producing work at such a high level, but still getting a lot of scrutiny about, is my work good enough? Oh, you might not make tenure. They were saying this to me on my process towards tenure. You might not get tenure. You got to put more out. But then I look at my white colleagues who were producing at lower ranked journals and not really actually producing a lot of work. And it was like, oh, they're the best thing since sliced bread. Look at what they've done. They're such a great contribution. And I would see those kinds of imbalances in many points in my career. And it just was a repeated pattern of just kind of feeling like I was not getting support or not getting the kind of validation for my work that my white colleagues were for doing less in a lot of ways that I felt. So kind of that like death by a thousand cuts, where no matter how much you work, you're always kind of having to overcome something that is not yours to overcome, right? And that people who are in a position of privilege or who have this kind of idealized identity sailing right by for work that I could never get away with publishing that level or in those places and get tenure with celebration, right? And I saw that happen to me and many other colleagues in academia. I had a lot of Black female colleagues who were pushed straight out of the tenure line when my white colleagues were not publishing and getting promoted all the way up to full, right? And so there are these moments where it's like, yeah, there's clear discrimination, but my colleagues, my white liberal colleagues, not having the language to see that that was happening, to talk about how they were participating in that, to support me through the process, right? So finding other spaces where I could talk to Black and brown people and they would say, yeah, girl, that's exactly what's happening. We can all see it. We can all see it. But my white colleagues saying, well, you don't have any proof of that. That's not what's going on. It's actually something else. And that's something that's followed me throughout my academic trajectory. That, I think a lot of Black women and people of color, people of marginalized identities encounter in a lot of spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the academic milieu can be really complicated for that reason, because if you are an academic, like the truth has a liberal bias, as they like to joke, and so academics who are in pursuit of truth tend to be more on the progressive side politically, tend to think of themselves as people who are not particularly racist, that they've done the work, they've done their homework, they've like learned about all the things they're supposed to learn about. And so very often you find that, your colleagues, your white colleagues are not ready to hear that there's still racism in academia because they're a part of it and they don't want to be a part of it. They don't think of themselves as being a part of it. And instead of necessarily trying to fix it, right? And this goes back to the ARCC, right? What do we mean when we talk about not just being not racist, but being anti-racist, right? And making that active move into thinking about how people are supported. I feel like on the whole, my experience as an academic has been relatively barrier-free. And I attribute no small part of that. I call it the double trump card, of sounding and acting like a Midwestern white person. And like that has been my cultural upbringing. It's what I fall back on. It is my language practice, but it's also my cultural practice. So this week with all of the memes about Tim Walz and how unbelievably Midwestern he is, I mean, I feel so targeted and seen. Where I'm like, oh yeah, no, I literally did have a tennis ball hanging in my garage to tell me how far to pull in, right? Like I just am that kind of middle belt white Ohioan. Um, and so that allowed me to move in certain kinds of ways. But then you also hit ceilings where people don't get to know that cultural practice first, and they're just looking at the face and they're just thinking about like who's before you. And so you get lots of odd comments. Sometimes you get more pushback. A lot of times from students who will learn something from a white professor in a way they will not accept the exact same presentation from a Black professor. But I'll add that I got the wonderful advice some years ago that we do a lot of work just by showing up, and that there's something to be said for slowing down and to the extent that we can within constraints of like Dr. Britt was talking about, sometimes people want to hold you to a higher standard, not sometimes, most of the time. But that remembering that, when I'm serving on a committee, sometimes my contribution to that committee is just making sure the committee is not all white men. And that somebody else's person, and yep, if I only worked 15 minutes on this committee this week and everybody else worked an hour, my other 45 minutes were just showing up and being Black. And that was a really important part of the contribution that I'm making to this endeavor.
I love that. Resonated with what you both said. I struggle to like try to be in white spaces and make people understand that like who I am is not just based on how I would look or what your expectations are of me. And it's a hard battle to have, but sometimes, like you said, like just showing up and being there to show people otherwise, like is all you can do. You don't have to go out and educate, you just have to be present and like let your like presence be known. So really, really like that. Thanks for sharing.
Yes, I definitely agree. I think just seeing you two here on the show as Black women getting PhDs, that already inspires me. Just a senior in high school, seeing how far you guys have gotten and representing a field that you're not represented well in, but representing yourself like really well. So that really inspires me. So thank you guys for being so amazing. I think one question that I have, kind of connecting to what you said, Dr. Greaser, about like anti-racism. We kind of did some research and we figured out that linguistics could actually have they do have a really big and main role in the fight towards racism. So how would you explain how your work as a linguist could actually contribute to the fight against racism?
Well, I think one of the really interesting things about language is one of the last spots where we feel pretty comfortable being nakedly racist. And I hope none of my students who are going to take my class this fall are going to watch this podcast just yet, because I like to fool them on the first day of class, and they take a class in which they think they're coming to learn about like all the ins and outs of nitty-gritty English grammar. And so I give them an English grammar test. And all 15 questions on the test have something that someone would be upset about. And so it's things like everyone left their book on the train, and didn't nobody have time for that? And there's 20 horses in the show. And so all of them are things that somebody'd be mad about to some extent. And they're just asked, is this right or wrong? I'm just testing to see how good you are, right? And then we talk about the fact that we're all in agreement about the ones that come from Black language. And that we have this thing that we've been taught that these ones are especially bad, and these ones are kind of like, I mean, there's 20 horses in the show. I don't even know what the problem is with that, right? So if you're going to contract it. And so we have these racial biases that we think of as not being biases. Long explanation to say that also allows us to flip it. And so it allows us this inroad to talk about race, to talk about racism, and to talk about some of these things that are more coded, where people think, okay, like I'm like great, like I'm not wearing a white cape and a pillowcase over my head, but the project is done. I'm clearly not a racist, right? Um, Language allows us that inroad to go, okay, well, but we can have more complicated conversations about this, and let's start here. And so that's one of the things I think is really cool about linguistics is it's subversive, and also like it's fun. Like I bring 150 kids into a classroom and spend a semester telling them that they're racist and classist and sexist, and somehow they really enjoy it. Um, so, so we have that opportunity to have those conversations.
And we have a really strong activist tradition in linguistics. I think linguistics is one of the places where I encountered the term scholar activist. So, we've got the great Geneva Smitherman. We've got, descendants of Geneva Smitherman like April Baker Bell. And they're doing work to elevate the status of Black language in the public eye. So again, being able to say Black language is a political act, right? And it's a political act that challenges centuries of white supremacy that says that Black people don't have language, they don't have culture, they're not human, right? And so to make that claim and then to take that and talk explicitly with students. So, I think about April Baker Bell's work in high schools and public schools with kids, teaching them what we learned from linguistics about Black language, to have them have conversations about the kind of linguistic discrimination that they are facing when people tell them, you sound ghetto, you sound ignorant, you sound XYZ. And now they have a language that comes from linguistics research, that comes from the scholar activist tradition that they can confront and actually know what's happening to them. Like, I know now I'm being discriminated against. I have language to challenge it, and I can push back and make a different claim about language. So there's this kind of pushing back against discourses and redefining discourses, right? So saying that those white supremacist discourses about Black speech will not be the norm for the next generation. And I think linguistics is a great place for creating that kind of activist tradition. But again, using what we know about language, debunking a lot of the myths that we have about language, but giving people a toolkit to assert their autonomy, to assert their right to speak their language, and to celebrate their language and bring it into spaces that they were historically told that language is not welcome. And again, linguistics gives us a toolkit for being able to do that.
Yes, I really agree. I really wish, like, something I'm advocating for in like my high schools is ethnic studies, and I really wish everyone was just required to learn about linguistics. I feel like it would give them a better understanding of like how to be anti-racist and just have way more knowledge in the world. Because I feel like linguistics is something that we experience like on the daily, like every single day we're talking to people. So I really wish that it was required, and I think I'm going to keep fighting for that. But thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah, and then we're about to wrap up the show, but before every show ends, we also want to give our speakers just one last moment to share any more final thoughts that you want to leave with your viewers. Do you guys have any last comments, anything else you want to say before we go?
I think for me, what's clear from this discussion is that all of us are linguists, right? In the sense that, all of us have a story of that moment when we discovered that our language was doing something in society, right? Whether it was identity, whether we saw that pushback, whether we saw that rejection, whether we saw language creating community, right? And I think that awareness is something that we all need to hold on to, right? And knowing that there's something there, and that there's a toolkit, there's a language to talk about that. You're not crazy, you're not alone. There's actually communities of people who share those experiences. And I think it's really about us taking that information, taking sometimes those observations, like very clear observations that we're having in our daily life, and using them to make a change, right? To talk about what we want to see going forward for our next generation and what we want to see different, in terms of how our kids experience or how our communities experience the world, right? When they speak a different language than the norm, how will they be received? And what space can we create that they have a different journey than some of us had whose language was not accepted or rejected?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fundamental thing is language is who we are. Um, language is uh, language is so important that we traded off choking on food for it. Like we had an option to function more like monkeys or dogs or cats where they can just swallow without too much trouble. We totally reconfigured our entire air apparatus to make it easier for us to make more complex sounds so that we could create the thousands upon thousands upon thousands of languages that we speak as humans. And that tells you something fundamental about how important that is to our existence as fellow humans. And so it's how we human, whether we are humaning to all the humans, to a subset of humans, or to a really small set of humans. And it all deserves celebration. It all deserves study. It all deserves uplifting. And so that's what we're here for.
Awesome. Really great messages from you all. And thank you so much, Dr. Grieser and Dr. Britt, for joining us on this episode of the ARC Deep Dive Show. Really appreciate your perspective and knowledge with the ARC community and those watching. And for those viewing right now, make sure to check out Dr. Grieser's book, The Black Side of River, Language, Race, and Belonging in Washington, D.C. We'll be able to post that on our join.org website in the next couple of days if you want to check it out or find it on whatever website you'll be able to find books in. And so also want to make sure you follow on our ARC social media to get news on our next events and initiatives, including our next deep dive show. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching, and thank you again for joining the show. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.